Hello, and welcome to a new season of Law Candor, the podcast still wholly devoted to pursuing the legal technology revolution. I'm Rob Hellewell, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Mariano, and we thank you for joining us. And wow, since we last talked with you, there have been a lot of exciting developments at Lighthouse. The biggest one, of course, is our recent acquisition of H5. We're really excited about expanding our team, bringing in more H5 innovative services, and on some of the podcasts this season, we'll be talking about this in more detail. But that's the future. On today's show, we're going to be exploring the important and sometimes unexpected role that linguistics plays with AI and legal technology. We're excited to introduce you to a new member of the Lighthouse team, Associate Director Amanda Jones. But before we get to that part of the show, we must first have
Sightings of Radical Brilliance.
And as the name implies, this is the part of the show where we bring you the latest news and basically anything that we find interesting and that reflects what we think is sheer genius. And we talk a lot about AI and sightings of radical brilliance. Today's no exception. And, Bill and I were reading an article, this appeared in AP. It's called How AI-Powered Tech Landed a Man in Jail with Scant Evidence. And specifically, this talks about technology that is used in a lot of cities, actually, especially big cities, where acoustics and microphones are set up to detect gunfire. And, once gunfire takes place, it will provide information that can direct law enforcement to where it is, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes everything doesn't go right.
Yeah, kicking off the season 8 with AI and murder. Interesting way to kick off the season, but it wasn't interesting. The technology is called Shot Spotter. And apparently, like Rob said, it triangulates by using acoustics where the shot came from. First, that it is a gunshot, and second, where it came from. And there's a series of proprietary technologies within this that this company's developed to do this. And law enforcement absolutely loves it. Even in the article where this man who ultimately was let go by the judge because it ultimately this technology wasn't perfect in the judge's opinion, and this was the sole piece of evidence against him. This guy Michael Williams, this poor guy has spent a year in jail. Apparently, he picked up his buddy during a riot last year in his town, and he saw a friend of his walking, and the guy tried to jump in his car, and he realized he knew him, lets him in the car. They're going to drive away. Another car drives by. And according to Mike Williams, a shot comes in through the passenger window, hits the passenger, they drive away. According to ShotSpotter, the shot was fired from inside the car, and that was the sole piece of evidence and the reason why this man spent a year in jail before the judge let him out. And whether this guy did it or not, the interesting thing here is the threshold that will allow this technology to come into court as the sole piece of evidence to convict someone, in this case of murder.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy in a way, and we see this problem even in the legal space or other places where AI is used, is that there's not a lot of understanding about the underlying algorithms, that are powering these. And you can have something that performs really well, like, Spot Shotter has generally good reviews from law enforcement, but there's some flaws. And when you start kind of digging into the flaws, a company's reaction is, hey, the AI is actually kind of our crown jewel here. And, we don't want to expose it too much because it's proprietary. But at the same time, these things have to be understood. And so there's kind of this interesting interplay.
I wonder how you set the threshold, because you look at because it could certainly still be a great tool for law enforcement, right? I mean, there's no one saying that it can't be from an investigatory perspective. However, there's plenty of techniques to gather evidence at some point that have been not allowed to cross the threshold to be admissible in court when you're putting someone up for a criminal behavior, such as, let's say, bite marks. I've seen documentaries on bite marks, and they say now that's junk science, and a lot of courts don't allow bite mark evidence. Lie detectors, not admissible. And so it's interesting that now it's almost so technical with the AI that I guess some judges are just deferring to it, and other judges are like, stop, hold on a second, we have to look under the hood here. A man's life is at stake, and I'd love to take the company's word for it that their algorithm is perfect, but what if it's not? And if it's a sole piece of evidence, is that in and of itself enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt?
Well, and I think the other interesting part about the article, and I guess it's actually related to a series of articles, is there are a lot of different ways that AI is touching our lives like this. This is just one example. And as that kind of proliferates and we see more and more of this, I think we'll see issues like this over and over. So interesting sighting to start off the show. And again, looking forward to kicking off this new season.
Yeah, let's kick off the new season. So let's get to our first guest of the new season. As Rob mentioned, it is Amanda Jones. We're going to discuss some common challenges and pitfalls that arise with modern language and e-discovery. We're also going to discuss the interplay between AI and linguistics. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Amanda's fantastic. And every time I hear her name, I think back to the movie Some Kind of Wonderful and that song, which I will be singing in my head while we are interviewing her. Anyway, let's get to Amanda.
Amanda, welcome to Law Candor. We used to just have people announce their, names and their title, but that got kind of boring. So what we've been trying to do lately is, it feels like everybody has a pretty interesting story about how they ended up in this e-discovery space. And we'd love just to hear yours. How did you get here?
Sure. So I guess I'm not sure how interesting it is. It's a series of accidents, maybe. I signed up for a linguistic course as an undergraduate when my philosophy elective that I wanted was full. And so I sort of stumbled into linguistics, found out I had a real affinity for it, probably more so than the philosophy course, and stuck with it to get an undergraduate degree and a master's. And then when I was thinking about what do I do next, a friend contacted me and said he knew of this little company in San Francisco who was hiring linguists to do e-discovery. And I said, I don't know what e-discovery is, but that sounds like it's for me. Hiring linguists was pretty much all I needed to hear. But even 16 years later, that still remains sort of one of my best decisions ever. It was great to get from sort of academia and theoretical linguistics into an applied context. I really enjoyed it.
I love that you actually liked the path you took, because so many times we ask that question and people are like, I really hated what I was doing. And someone said, hey, you can program a VCR. Would you like to work on this new thing called e-discovery? And they pushed them into it, and they just sort of happened to be here. That also reflects in their attitude, because most of those people are pretty bitter. And obviously you're not. You enjoy what you do. So super excited. We don't often on this podcast talk about Lighthouse as a company or our products. We try to keep it fairly neutral in that regard, but it would be sort of ridiculous for us to ignore one of the biggest acquisitions in our strategic acquisition, certainly in our industry, and that's Lighthouse acquiring H5, which we're all super excited about. So from your perspective, what are you excited about? Because you come from that linguistic background, as you said, and that's not necessarily how Lighthouse attacked e-discovery. I mean, we took a much different approach.
For my day-to-day, I'm super excited about the fact that suddenly we have this new, huge horizon that we have in front of us, and there's just so much potential. These two companies that have always been really focused on customer service and client satisfaction, and really dedicated to sort of bringing technology to bear to make everything more efficient. But we've been using different kinds of people and different kinds of technology, and seeing what will happen when we bring those things together and have a ton of data at our fingertips to work with and learn from. It's just insight waiting to happen, and really just explosive potential there. So that's really what I'm excited to see play out.
Yeah, it seems like it's a great combination. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm on our side too. Maybe just getting back to the topic of our discussion, one thing we kind of struggle with in our industry sometimes is definitions. And, we talk about analytics a lot. But for linguistics, I think it would be great if maybe just to set the stage with, when we talk about linguistics and linguistic modeling, what exactly does that mean?
Okay, yes, that's a great question, because I do think a lot of people maybe have this idea that they hear linguistics or linguistic modeling and they think keyword search, or maybe fancy keywords where you're using Boolean operators and really well-placed wildcards and proximity. But in fact, it goes a little bit further than that. Linguistics is really the study of language and language patterns, and basically any facet of the world and the structure of language that has hidden patterns that govern how that language will be used and how it plays out in a variety of contexts. So it's syntax and morphology and also semantics, but then also just the pragmatics of how language is used in specific contexts by specific social groups. So there are a lot of pressures that influence how language is used. And when we're going about linguistic modeling, what we're trying to do is uncover those patterns and encode them in these complex queries so that they're not only complex, but they reflect these hypotheses about how the world is going to work and how a given person is going to express a given concept in a specific scenario and use case and context in their world. And so that's what linguistic modeling is trying to do, is find out how people are going to talk about something in the language of spreadsheets for a particular purpose, or or in an email, or in this other context for some other reason, in reports, etc. We have to get the whole range, and really these are all hypotheses, not just complex queries.
So Amanda, when we talk about linguistic modeling, what's an example that people can relate to that kind of highlights what that really means in the context of the work that we do?
That's a great question. It's hard to come up with an example right off the top of my head, but I think one of the things that always occurs to me is when you think about the topic of revenue, you're going to have a different perspective and a different way of speaking about it if you're considering a C-suite kind of person, an executive level person, versus a marketing person versus a programmer, right? And programmers probably don't care all that much about revenue and might not talk about it a lot, but if they did, they would talk about it quite differently. Or a given piece of new technology, they're also going to talk about that very differently than the marketing person who's going to want a spin that's accessible versus the C-suite person who's going to want to know how much money is this likely to make for us. And not only that, like different individuals have different jargon and different ways of speaking about things and different perspectives that they focus on, but they also will do it differently depending on the mode, right? So if they're trying to say something about revenues in a spreadsheet, it's going to look quite different than it would look in the preparation for an annual report that's going to be shared with investors, etc. All of these things matter. All of these things influence how these concepts are going to be realized, and the different words that people will use, and the structures, and the formality, and the register that's going to be used to discuss these things. And so I think that's the sort of thing that you have to take into consideration when you're doing linguistic modeling that probably won't occur to people if they're brainstorming a keyword list, right? Even if it's a fancy keyword list. Usually people get to synonyms and maybe where can I put my wildcard, and that's probably the extent of it, but they're not thinking very specifically about all these contexts that might be relevant and all the different speakers who might be talking about these things very differently.
I know when Bill talks about it, he only uses money emojis, so I totally get what you're saying. That makes sense.
And I also use the I pronoun
Right.
on it.
Right.
Talk about a little bit some of the best applications of even the combination of linguistics with AI, right? Because it's not either or, right?
Right. And I think that that's one of the most exciting possibilities, really, is that you have this potential to bring these kinds of approaches together, because really, I think that linguistics and NLP, to a certain extent, are a way of injecting sort of top-down human knowledge into a process that is otherwise very bottom-up, very disconnected, data point-driven statistical analysis. That is incredibly powerful, the sort of classic machine learning statistical analysis of raw data points. Incredibly powerful, but you sort of lose this element of the order and structure and classes and analogy that human beings use to sort of organize the world and make sense of it. And so I think that when we bring these two things together, there's just a huge potential for applications that are going to really bring nuanced information to the classification and inject sophisticated results, and the results that are more recognizable to the human beings who are actually consuming it. So you can get there faster if you sort of inject both perspectives. And I think one way that we've been seeing this done more and more lately is via these sort of pre-trained classifiers. I think that there's a ton of potential to use these, particularly when you're working with a given corporation who has this community of speakers. You might start off with this pre-trained classifier that's meant to identify documents expressing a certain concept that comes up over and over again in their litigation landscape or regulatory compliance efforts, etc. So you pre-train it. But then over time, it gets more and more examples of how the given community talks about these concepts of interest, and it gets better and better and better until you have this reusable asset that you can apply and deploy at the beginning of any given project to get a huge head start on the information retrieval task at hand. So I think pre-trained classifiers that are customized and refined over time have huge potential. So this is like PII or potential privilege. I've seen it work really well for those things, but really we scratched the surface only of what we could do with these kinds of classifiers.
It's interesting, and just following up on that, it's interesting that you say that because when I think of AI coupled with linguistics, especially since the acquisition, learning more about how H5 attacks these scenarios, it's complementary in that it does lend context that maybe AI by itself does not pick up on, right? Because AI might just see zeros and ones when they're making decisions on certain things, and certainly powerful in finding trends, but providing that additional context for, by industry or even by that individual company might even bring out more, certainly more powerful insight into the data you're looking at, to keep, again, if our combined goal is to keep eyes off documents, especially expensive eyes off documents, the combined application of these technologies is really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I really think that for a while there, we were sort of having to choose one or the other. And in a way, we were sort of always throwing out the baby with the bathwater to a certain extent by going with just one. And so I think bringing both of them together, you get these really great results that are of an order of magnitude better than what you could see with any given technology operating alone and in a vacuum.
Well, and maybe just explore that a little deeper. I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with TAR. I think the legal community is definitely getting more accustomed to it. And sometimes TAR is really just looked at as a machine learning or an AI-based way of, reducing data. But how are you using linguistics to maybe, enhance that?
So what we've found is that one of the best ways to use linguistics is sort of by making these queries that will tackle the knowledge that we know about in advance, the stuff that we know, we just get that out of the door, or we use it for these kind of more arcane aspects. So machine learning in the context of technology-assisted review, it's great at doing heavy lifting. It does a whole lot of coverage on concepts that are core and really pronounced in the data set. Whereas linguistics can do things like immediately reflect information and knowledge that an attorney has about what's of interest in the case. And we can go after that immediately, even if it's rare, for instance. So some of these contexts are incredibly important to a case, but quite rare. And those things tend to be extremely difficult for machine learning to pick up on, or it takes a very long time for it to come to that because it's almost not a generalization, right? It's one specific kind of knowledge that happens as a rare event. Well, linguistics can go in there and grab that. And linguistics has also proven to be very good at sort of upping the precision without giving away recall. So the machine learning can come and find this huge number of really great core documents, and then have this huge number of little tiny misses down in the sort of lower ranges that it's just not picking up on because the pattern's not pronounced enough. Well, linguistics can go and grab those in a fairly precise way and push them right up there to the top with all the rest that the machine learning has found. And so you get this nice combination of recall and precision at the same time, which is sort of the holy grail of information retrieval.
Let's talk a little bit, Amanda, about the different sources of data we're seeing today with whether it be Slack or Teams or any of these more collaborative platforms.
Right. Yes, it's becoming more and more challenging because all of these modalities of communication are emerging. So it wasn't really all that long ago when people were just using paper or reports or memos or briefings to express things in business communications. And then the advent of email came along and things got more informal and closer to spoken language rather than these formal written pieces that had more structure. And so that added complexity. But then once you get to IMs, you get this huge telegraphing that happens in this abbreviated conversation and these sorts of little almost code that people use with one another.
It's like
close.
Shorthand. We've gone from formal to informal to shorthand.
And then bring in Slack and Teams, and the definition of a document even begins to break down, right? Because you have multiple speakers having conversations that could span months, if not longer.
What about emojis?
Emojis,
right?
also.
Take a look at this to your GC, and he gives you a thumbs up. I mean,
yes.
That could actually signify something.
Right. So not only is it like the language now you have to cover with this huge variability in style and presentation, but the technologies that are being used to sort of extract that information from these complex platforms, that needs to advance and get better to allow us better access and to present it to users in a readable format. It's really, that is a huge challenge. I think we'll be wrangling with that one for a long time, because it's not going to stop right now. Now that the box is open, Pandora's box is open, we're just going to continue to find new ways to talk to one another, and it's going to continue to evolve very quickly, I think.
And Amanda, one thing we try to do is to give some practical, information for people listening. If you're a company or a lawyer and you're thinking about using linguistics, what are some of the real practical strategies that you've seen be effective?
I think, one thing that I've seen over and over again, and a tip I would give anyone probably generally, is don't shortchange the design process and the education and the knowledge sharing. I think that, those things are incredibly important no matter what kind of application you're going to have. But I think that it's particularly important if you're going to try to bring linguistics to bear and this other side of AI technology, because you're trying to model how human beings think about their topic of interest and how they talk about it, how this given community of attorneys plus the corporate individuals who are sort of custodians who are doing the actual talking, what's of interest to them and how it's expressed by that community. It's really important to get a true understanding of that when we're trying to do linguistic modeling of these concepts, because there's just so much room for interpretation, and people can be a little bit subjective and they can disagree with one another and things like that. And if you want a model that's going to give you great results, you really have to understand what is the interpretation and expectation of this particular group of people who we are trying to satisfy, and to come up with a model that will generate results that match those expectations and really fit out of the gate or close to it. It's important to give that design phase and that knowledge transfer its due. Does that make sense? Does that get at the question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So that's my biggest tip, is don't rush, because there is this temptation of like, I want results really quick. I want to see what the machine's going to do. The machine only does as good a job as it's designed to do, right? And so you have to invest in the design.
And Amanda, when you think about how linguistics and AI will evolve, as we go into the future, how do you see that impacting our industry?
I think that everyone's going to need to up their game, right? And learn how to keep up with the technology that's emerging on the AI side of things, and also keep up with the computing power that's available to us now. So a lot of these things that were sort of too heavy in the past, like linguistic modeling or natural language processing, those are fairly heavy and they used to be difficult to sort of leverage. And now they're not out of reach. And the ability to bring together those with staying on top of the most cutting edge machine learning approaches, I think everyone's going to have to embrace that and keep up. And it's just going to continue to be something where more and more approaches are brought together, in technology and tactics there are brought together to sort of come up with this result that will fit the use case, because not everything needs the same approach. And the more people are able to bring different methods together, the better we're going to be able to satisfy a variety of use cases.
Amanda, this has been a great session. It's really, I think, the first time that we've really explored, the impact of linguistics. And I will do my best to try to summarize this a little bit. I won't do it as well as you, but we talked about how to define linguistic modeling and how it's really understanding how language is playing out in the way that people are communicating with each other in the cases that we're working on. We talked about some of the critical challenges. This is really something that is more complex than just, better search terms. It's really understanding the way that people are communicating, and even maybe developing, pre-trained classifiers that can be used over and over that are really fitted to a certain client. We talked a little bit about linguistics and TAR, and how linguistics really has the ability to understand some of that nuance that is more difficult, for machine learning, and can result in a much better or a more precise data set. We also covered just some of the best applications, and that when you're really talking about that combination of AI and linguistics, you can really expect to see better results. And I love the practical advice. I think that's always some of the best. And I think, that advice of just taking the time to really focus on design, to understand the context and the nuances of, what you're trying to uncover with linguistics or AI is really a critical point. And I think that was just great advice. We really want to thank you for joining today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we look forward to more.
I have a request of our producer when we name this. I think we should name this episode Some Kind of Wonderful. Amanda, I hope you know where I'm going with this. Because there's a song in that movie called Amanda Jones by the March Violets. I'm assuming you know about this, right? Because if there was a song called Bill Mariano somewhere, even if it was from 86, I would know every lyric to that song. So what I'm thinking is we're going to have a theme song playing in, a theme song playing out. We're going to name the episode Some Kind of Wonderful. Just because I'm an 80s movie geek and I'm an Eric Stoltz fan, what happened to that guy? I mean, he was the guy in Mask, for God's sakes. Hell of an actor. And I think his career was just overlooked. Great movie, great song. Great podcast. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We are going to play that song in and out of this break, hopefully.
Thanks,
I don't know if we can get the rights to it. I don't know if it'll cost Lighthouse $1 million, but I can't imagine the March Violets are going to charge much. It's not like we're looking to play Alive by Pearl Jam here. Okay, this is a song that was a one and done band, so maybe we can get the rights to it.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Amanda. Hey folks, if you like the show, be sure to show us some love by rating Law and Candor on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Subscribe to the show, follow us on Twitter, all of your social media outlets. We appreciate the support.